Okay, so the live stream is up. Just give us a minute to make sure that we actually in the right Zoom room.
We are ready on the live stream.
Thank you. Sergeants, you may begin your recordings.
Recording to the BC has started.
Recording to the cloud has started as well.
Backup is rolling.
Thank you. Okay, good morning. Welcome to today's New York City Council remote hearing on the Committee on Resiliency and Waterfronts jointly with the Committee on Housing and Buildings. At this time, will all panelists please turn on your videos. Thank you. To minimize disruption, please place all electronic devices to vibrate or silent mode. Thank you. If you wish to submit testimonies, you may do so at testimony@council.nyc.gov. I repeat, testimony@council.nyc.gov. Thank you for your kind cooperation. Chair Brannan, we're ready to begin.
Thank you. My name is Justin Brannan. I have the privilege of chairing the Committee on Resiliency and Waterfronts, and I want to welcome you to today's joint hearing with the Committee on Housing and Buildings on the state of housing resiliency along the waterfront. I want to first thank my co-chair, Councilmember Cornegy, for holding this hearing. And I just want to acknowledge all the other members who have joined us this morning. Council members Grodenchik, Chin, Gennaro, Jonai, Cabrera, Diaz Sr., Ulrich, Rosenthal, Rose, Lewis, and Rivera. I think that's everybody. If I miss someone, please send me a text. And today we're going to examine how resilient our waterfront infrastructure and buildings are and what we're doing to ensure that buildings are designed and built to withstand multiple climate hazards that the city faces. We'll also examine the practicality of continuing to build along the waterfront. Coastal flooding and severe storms are becoming more intense and occurring more frequently. We all know this. A recent study by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration found that coastal communities are experiencing twice the number of high tide flooding events than they were just 20 years ago. By the 2030s, less than 10 years from now, low-lying areas in the city could experience 20 to 40 flood days each year. Such flooding has a significant impact on our buildings and our infrastructure. The city has more residents living in high-risk flood zones than any other city in the country. And people who live in these high-risk flood zones and have a federal-backed mortgage must have flood insurance. FEMA, which administers the National Flood Insurance Program, developed Risk Rating 2.0, a new flood insurance rating system. This new rating system went into effect last month for all new flood insurance policies. In the city's 10 poorest zip codes, 38% of premiums will increase. Flood insurance is important, but these rate increases will have significant negative effects on low-income individuals who already struggle to afford flood insurance. In September, before the new rating system went into effect, the city embarked on a one-month education campaign to inform property owners about the importance of flood insurance. What else is the city doing? I look forward to hearing what outreach has been conducted and what additional outreach and financial support is planned to help alleviate this economic burden on families that are just trying to make ends meet. As sea levels continue to rise and flooding and storm surges worsen, waterfront buildings will become more and more susceptible to the impacts of climate change. In June of this year, a 12-story beachfront condo in Miami partially collapsed, killing 98 people. Hurricanes, storm surges, and salty air penetrated the building's concrete and rusted its rebar and steel columns. The tragedy ignited safety concerns from residents living in high-rise buildings all throughout the country, including right here in New York. The building's collapse may have been avoided if it had been properly maintained and had resilient features to protect it from severe weather events. We must learn from this, and we must ensure that our waterfront buildings are and continue to be built to avoid such tragedies. Earlier this year, the council passed Intro 2092, the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. The pilot program required by the law should be underway, I look forward to hearing what types of buildings and facilities have been included in the pilot. I also look forward to discussing how city buildings will incorporate resilient features and how we can expand such requirements to all buildings. Today, we'll also hear Intro 2198, sponsored by Councilmember Jonai. This bill would require the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability to conduct a study on the feasibility of relocating above-ground power lines underground. The city conducted a similar study back in 2013, but 8 years and several damaging storms later, it's time for another discussion on the feasibility of undergrounding these above-ground power lines. I look forward to hearing from the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency and the Department of Buildings during today's hearing. Before I turn it over to Co-Chair Cornegy, I want to thank my committee staff, Committee Counsel Jessica Steinberg-Albin, Senior Policy Analyst Patrick Mulvihill, Senior Finance Analyst Jonathan Seltzer, my Senior Advisor John Yedden, Chief of Staff Chris McCrite, and my Legislative Director Michael Sheldon, as well as the staff for the Housing and Buildings Committee for all their hard work in putting this hearing together. I now want to turn it over to my co-chair, Councilmember Cornegy, to give his opening statement.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. We had technical difficulties this morning. Thank you, Chair Brennan. Good morning, everyone. I'm Councilmember Robert Cornegy, Chair of the Council's Committee on Housing and Buildings. I'm pleased to be joining my colleague, Councilmember Justin Brannan, and the Committee on Resiliency and Waterfronts, together with members of the Committee on Housing and Buildings, for today's hearing on housing resiliency along the waterfront. New York City has had more than its fair share of experiences with climate events. In this past year alone, we've experienced tropical storms Elsa, Henry, and Ida, all of which brought historic levels of rainfall and flooding to our city. The state of New York ranks third in the nation for the most homes at risk of coastal inundation from sea level rise by the end of the 21st century, and with many of these homes at risk in our very boroughs. There's also the risk of our communities face from flooding caused by rainfall, which disproportionately affects low-income communities and communities of color. This is a huge source of property damage within the city. Even in the landlocked neighborhoods in my district like Crown Heights and Bedford-Stuyvesant, following the aftermath of Tropical Storm Ida, residents in Crown Heights, which has some of the highest points in Brooklyn, suffered flooding basements and ground floors. Meanwhile, in Bed-Stuy, flooding was so bad that a handball court on Ralph Avenue and Monroe Street resembled a swimming pool in addition. The city logged 617 311 complaints related to flooding in Bed-Stuy zip code. In addition to flooding, the city suffers other climate events like heat waves and snowstorms, both of which the city has been facing with increasing intensity and regularity. There's an urgent need to understand what the city can do to protect its residents and prepare for the climate events we can expect in our future. I look forward to hearing testimony from the administration, industry experts, advocates, and interested members of the public. This is an incredibly important and precedent issue, and today's testimony will be instrumental in addressing current problems as well as planning for our future. Thank you. And I just want to add that I think that people forget to realize that we are a maritime city and that our waterways play an incredible part in everything from tourism and hospitality to recreation in our city. So it's very important. And thank you for co-hosting this hearing with me, Chair Brannan.
Thank you, Chair Cornegy. I want to now turn it over to Councilmember Jonai, who wants to make a statement on his bill.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairs Brannan and Cornegy, for holding this joint hearing and giving Intro 2189 the opportunity for discussion. I look forward to hearing from the public and the administration's feedback on this bill. We've all heard the tale of two cities. In this case, it's the tale of two boroughs, which is played out in many ways, but perhaps none so glaringly disproportionate as storm impact and power loss. While Manhattan certainly braces for storms, the outer boroughs need to brace much harder. After the Great Blizzard of 1888, Manhattan's power lines were buried underground. Over a century later, the remaining four boroughs still have power lines lingering above ground, bearing the brunt of storms and risking power outage. Tropical storm Isaias left nearly 120,000 homes without power, of which Manhattan only accounted for 67, or less than 0.06%. The other 99.94% of power loss was in the outer boroughs, which we can safely assume that the above-ground power lines played a major role in. Without meaningful change and investment, this trend will continue. Loss of power, especially for prolonged periods, is not just a mere inconvenience. New Yorkers suffer. Seniors and the sick often have life-sustaining machines reliant on power. Low-income families can't afford the cost of food spoilage, and remote working, as it becomes more common, the loss of power can affect livelihoods. And small businesses affected lose income and perishables that could make a difference between a profit or loss for the year. Advances in climate science suggest that storms will strike with greater frequency in the years to come. We need to be ready. Intro 2189 gets the ball rolling with a feasibility study that will lay the groundwork for our city to invest in its infrastructure by placing power lines underground. I remind all, Washington is currently debating a nearly $2 trillion package that addresses infrastructure and climate. New York could be negotiating to get the funding that is needed for this project, which would be a sound investment that would bring parity and justice to the outer borough residents and businesses. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Jonai. I now want to turn it over to the committee counsel, Jessica Steinberg Alvin, to go over some procedural items.
Thank you, Chair Brannan. I am Jessica Steinberg Alvin, counsel to the Committee on Resiliency and Waterfronts, and I will be moderating this hearing. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone that you will be on mute until you are called on to testify, at which point you will be unmuted by the host. During the hearing, I will be calling on panelists to testify. Please listen for your name to be called, as I will periodically announce who the next panelists will be. We will first hear testimony from the administration, followed by testimony from Con Edison, followed by members of the public. During the hearing, if council members would like to ask a question of the administration or a specific panelist, please use the Zoom raise hand function, and I will call on you in order. We will be limiting council member questions to 5 minutes, which includes the time it takes to answer these questions. For members of the public, we will be limiting speaking time to 3 minutes in order to accommodate all who wish to speak today. Once you are called on to testify, please begin by stating your name and the organization you represent, if any. We will now call on representatives of the administration to testify. Appearing today for the administration will be Janie Bavishi, Director of the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, Suzanne DeRoche, Deputy Director for Infrastructure and Energy of the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, and Joseph Ackroyd, Assistant Commissioner for Technical Affairs and Code Development of the Department of Buildings. At this time, I will administer the affirmation to each representative of the administration. I will call on each of you individually for a response. Please raise your right hands. Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions? Director Bavishi.
Yes.
Deputy Director DeRoche.
Yes.
Assistant Commissioner Ackroyd.
Yes.
Thank you. At this time, I will invite Director Bavishi to present testimony. Please begin when ready.
Good morning. I am Janie Bavishi, Director of the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. I would like to thank Chairs Brannan and Cornegy for the opportunity to testify today. I would also like to acknowledge my colleague, Suzanne DeRoche, Deputy Director for Infrastructure and Energy at the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency and Mayor's Office of Climate and Sustainability, and Joseph Ackroyd, Assistant Commissioner for Technical Affairs and Code Delivery at the Department of Buildings, both of whom will join me in answering your questions. As you know, the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency is responsible for ensuring that New York City is prepared to withstand and emerge stronger from the impacts of climate change. Our role is to lead the city's strategic direction and planning to prepare for extreme events and chronic impacts, and coordinate with agencies to implement this work. Within our citywide resiliency portfolio, the city is preparing to adapt to a variety of climate hazards. Our climate adaptation strategy takes a multi-layered approach, focused on establishing multiple lines of defense at different scales across the city to respond to the multiple hazards. Some of these lines of defense including adapting neighborhoods, developing building level protections, protecting critical infrastructure, and supporting businesses and residents. Today, my testimony will focus on the suite of strategies that we are using to ensure housing resiliency on the waterfront, including how we are building for the future, what we are doing to manage climate impacts on our existing housing stock, opportunities to reform policy to advance resilient housing, and upcoming initiatives. I will also address the proposed legislation, Intro 2189. I'd like to begin by addressing how we build for the future. Housing resiliency is supported by building code based on the best available science and engineering knowledge, which is why our office has partnered with the Department of Buildings to update Appendix G of the building code and establish stringent standards for the construction of all new and substantially rehabilitated structures in the floodplain. We will need to go even further to account for rapidly changing conditions that will lead to more flooding that is both more frequent and extends outside of our current floodplain. To this end, our office is also partnering with FEMA to develop future flood risk maps that go beyond the FEMA flood insurance rate maps, which are only based on historic flood risk information. Once finalized, we hope to use these future flood risk maps as a regulatory tool that will inform the building code with property-specific information about flood risk that incorporates sea level rise. We look forward to working with Council when you review future building code updates to ensure the city's building stock accounts for future flood conditions. Our office is also delighted to share that over 20 city capital agencies will begin designing and constructing dozens of new projects using the New York City Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines, which were developed by the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency using cutting-edge science and research. This ensures that projects constructed today will be prepared for worsening extreme weather decades into the future and can continue to provide critical services to New Yorkers. Soon, very soon, we will be announcing the projects that will be included in the pilot program required by Local Law 41. These projects were selected through a rigorous process that considered climate exposure, equity, and project scope. We look forward to using the results of the pilot to inform the broader city mandate around use of the design guidelines across the entire capital plan, starting in 2026. Building code is a critical tool for dealing with future climate change impacts on new or substantially upgraded buildings. But in a growing city with over 1 million existing buildings, we must also consider how retrofits and upgrades will help us withstand and recover better from a hotter and wetter future. We must also think deeply about how to engage and problem solve with the communities that will be most impacted by extreme weather. We have already started this work. Following Hurricane Sandy, the city led 3 major retrofit efforts. The Build It Back program, which helped over 12,500 families recover from the impacts of the storm and return to their homes. The HPD Sandy Multifamily Program, which completed repairs and resiliency retrofits serving nearly 20,000 units of multifamily housing. And the $3 billion NYCHA Sandy Recovery Program, which is upgrading and reinforcing 35 Sandy impacted NYCHA developments. These programs and projects were ambitious and precedent-setting in their scope and impact, and also left us with many lessons learned. Recently, NYCHA released its forward-looking climate change adaptation plan based on insights gained from the Hurricane Sandy recovery implementation, which will serve as a blueprint for future retrofits on NYCHA campuses. After Hurricane Ida, the city also announced a series of commitments related to our built environment in the report entitled The New Normal, Combating Storm-Related Extreme Weather in New York City. As mentioned in the report, we will begin an interagency assessment of the city's housing stock so that we can develop and augment existing programs to increase climate risk awareness, reduce climate risk exposure, and provide retrofit and housing mobility assistance. While we are just beginning this process, this comprehensive housing analysis will help us understand the climate adaptation needs for millions of New York residents. In the meantime, we are working with FEMA to conduct a backwater valve study to determine exactly where backwater valves will be most effective. Backwater valves may be a low-cost retrofit that would benefit many New Yorkers. The results of this backwater valve study, which is on track to be completed next summer, will inform the scale of the city's installation program, areas of prioritization, and direct community outreach by clearly delineating what types of buildings and locations would most benefit from backwater valves. We are also restarting and expanding a range of services through Flood Help NY, including resiliency audits, financial counseling, and operational trainings for 1 to 4 family homes and vulnerable multifamily buildings. These services are critically important for helping homeowners and renters to understand their risks and the available mitigation options. With that said, low-cost financing for retrofits is the biggest challenge we face when it comes to adapt our existing building stock, and support from all levels of government is essential to advance this priority because of the enormous scope and scale of the need. While we advance programs and policy to ensure the resiliency of our housing, we also remain focused on advocating for critical policy reforms at the state and federal levels. In particular, the city has been and will continue to advocate for reforms to the National Flood Insurance Program, including greater affordability, increased mitigation options, and better communication and claims reform. In May, we testified to Congress and penned an op-ed in The Hill to highlight our platform in light of the changes FEMA is implementing through Risk Rating 2.0. Even as we advocate for these changes, we continue to do our part to raise awareness about flood risk and flood insurance, given that insurance is one of the most important financial resiliency tools for residents. Our partnership with the Center for New York City Neighborhoods and Flood Help NY provides all New Yorkers with a resource to assess their flood risk based on their property location and to learn more about flood insurance enrollment. Since 2021, New York City has seen National Flood Insurance Program policies increase by approximately 50% citywide. This enrollment success is due in part to our extensive outreach and education work, including a $1.1 million outreach campaign with FEMA this past hurricane season. At the state level, there are also tremendous policy opportunities. We hope to advance a flood risk disclosure mandate for real estate transactions to increase market transparency. Currently, sellers in New York State can opt out of disclosing a property's history, including the history of flooding and any flood insurance requirements, by paying $500. This opt-out reduces a buyer's understanding of the flood risk they face before they purchase a home and potential future costs due to flooding. Additionally, there are currently no obligations for landlords to provide flood risk and flood history information to tenants. Improving transparency of flood risk and flood insurance requirements can be easily solved with improved disclosure requirements. Legislation to strengthen the state's requirements for flood risk disclosure were introduced in both the New York State Senate and Assembly earlier this year and passed in the Senate. The city supports passage of this bill in the year ahead. We are continuing to build on and expand the efforts that I have described thus far to ensure the resiliency of New York City's housing. As we do this, we know that New Yorkers will experience the impacts from climate change unevenly. That is why in the draft goals and strategies of the Comprehensive Waterfront Plan, which was released for public comment during the summer and will be finalized by the end of the year, the Department of City Planning introduced a coastal land use framework informed by the best available climate science. The aim of the framework is to support decision-making about future development and public investments in housing and infrastructure with an evolving understanding of flood risks. This framework will help promote housing stability in relation to climate risks by establishing different approaches to residential density based on the capacity for neighborhoods to adapt and withstand the impacts of climate change through the 2050s. These approaches include increasing residential density, maintaining permanent density, and limiting future residential density. The Coastal Land Use Framework will build off work that DCP has already initiated, including the 2017 designation of special coastal risk districts. After extensive community engagement, special coastal risk districts were created for neighborhoods that flood regularly from high tides and are projected to face daily tidal inundation. The zoning designation limits the density of future development to avoid further growth of the residential population in a highly vulnerable area, while allowing the many current residents to make investments in their existing homes to make them safer. Broad Channel and Hamilton Beach, Queens, and East Shore of Staten Island are all examples of these districts. The Coastal Land Use Framework presents a way to align future development and public investments in housing and infrastructure with our understanding of flood risk in neighborhoods. The Comprehensive Waterfront Plan also acknowledges that there are areas of cities that face increasing exposure to chronic high tide flooding, and the ability to maintain uninterrupted access to a decent, safe, and sanitary home may become compromised over time. This scenario requires the development of programs and services that support housing mobility so that New Yorkers can choose to improve their housing stability by moving away from flood risk. Such programs and services related to flooding risk could include housing counseling, voluntary buyouts, housing search and moving assistance, estate planning, and down payment assistance. The city is actively pursuing federal resources to create programs and services for a set of housing mobility services that will specifically prioritize housing stability for low and moderate income households and support their ability to plan and finance a future move. Together, housing mobility, financial counseling, resiliency audits, and retrofit programs are envisioned as a suite of solutions to support property owners and renters' housing stability as climate risks increase. As you can hear from my testimony, there are many different strategies and tools the city is employing to make our housing, buildings, communities, and residents more resilient. We look forward to delivering a comprehensive citywide climate adaptation plan next year, thanks to Council's leadership on Intro 1620. This plan will evaluate the impacts of the various climate hazards that New York City faces, incorporate the latest findings in climate science, and articulate and build consensus around a climate adaptation strategy. This is a significant step forward that will ensure continuous, strategic, and transparent leadership that helps the city become even more resilient to the threats caused by climate change. Regarding Intro 2189-2021, our office recognizes the intent of this bill, and we understand there are certainly cases where power lines above ground can cause outages for residents. In 2013, the Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, with support from Con Edison, released a report entitled Utilization of Underground and Overhead Power Lines in the City of New York. At that time, the study found undergrounding citywide to be prohibitively expensive. We understand that Con Edison recently started to underground power lines in some parts of the city and will be looking for support at their upcoming rate case to expand this work. We will be working closely with them on these future plans. We believe that exploration of where and how undergrounding would be useful and feasible should be led by Con Edison based on their knowledge and expertise. While our office could support this in an advisory capacity, we do not have access to Con Edison's data and are not staffed to perform the study. In conclusion, I would like to thank the Committees on Resiliency and Waterfronts and Housing and Buildings for allowing me to testify here today. Resiliency strategies require the collaboration and partnership at all levels of government, and I look forward to joining my colleagues in answering your questions about housing resiliency along the waterfront.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. I will now turn it over to questions from Chair Brannan, followed by Chair Cornegy. Panelists, please stay unmuted if possible during this question and answer period. Thank you. Chair Brannan, you may begin your questions.
Thanks, Jess. I want to give Councilman Jonai an opportunity to ask questions since it's his bill we're hearing.
Thank you, Chair Brannan, and thank you for that report, Director Bavishi. You mentioned expensive, and you mentioned that you would rely on Con Edison to determine where and what locations we should be focusing on removing the above ground power lines to below ground. I just wonder when after 1888 winter, where all of Manhattan enjoys the privilege of having underground power lines, why now we have to rely on Con Edison to determine is not sensible. And the word expensive, how expensive would it be for all power lines to be buried underground, citywide, all 4 boroughs?
Thank you, Councilmember Jonai, for the question. I'm going to defer to my colleague, Deputy Director DeRoche, to answer this question.
Thank you, Janie. So what we mentioned in our testimony is that the city did study this in 2013, so right after Sandy, and that study did find that undergrounding lines was prohibitively expensive. However, a lot has changed since 2013, and we understand that Con Edison is moving forward with plans. They already have areas of the city that they are actively looking to underground, and are looking to expand that to other places. I'm not going to speak on behalf of Con Edison. They're here today and will testify in more detail on what those plans are. But in regards to your question about the city's role in studying undergrounding, Con Edison is regulated by New York State, the Public Service Commission, and we do not have access to Con Edison's data as to where and how undergrounding should happen throughout the city. Each neighborhood has different characteristics, and they are in the best place to look at those characteristics and identify what areas should be undergrounded.
Thank you, Deputy Director. Deputy Director, the question isn't which neighborhoods. It should be all neighborhoods. It should be all 5 boroughs, just like Manhattan, that enjoys that privilege. So when you say the word expensive, that must mean you have a number that was given to you. What is the cost of burying all power lines?
So I'm going to defer that question to Con Edison. We do not have access to current cost information, and I understand they will be speaking to that today.
Then, Deputy Director, we should be careful when we say expensive. If you don't have data and don't know the numbers, you cannot assume it's expensive or inexpensive. That's the point I'm making.
I understand.
And currently, Washington is debating a $2 trillion package that could be used for New York City to bury all power lines. Do you, Deputy Director or Director, do we know the cost to the city when we lose power lines due to storms and trees, the maintenance of those trees and cutting of branches, and the damage that impacts New Yorkers and the cost of the city during power outages due to power lines?
So that's a great question, and every storm is different. We know we undertake tree trimming in conjunction with Con Edison, and those costs that Con Edison incurs are reported to the Public Service Commission. So again, I'm going to defer to them to answer specific cost questions related to power outages.
But do we know what the city's responsibility for those, the expense associated with tree trimming is?
So I'd be happy to get more information to you regarding a particular storm. And if you like to get back to us about which storm you want the cost information for, we can get that to you.
The point I'm trying to make is this is going to continue to be an expense to the city, whether it be tree trimming or repairs to power lines. And the sooner we invest in the long-term solution of burying our power lines, we're going to be spending good money after bad money. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. And relying on Con Edison to give the information, I assure you that you'll stay on, I hope. You'll hear Con Edison response will divert back to the city and saying they're not prepared, they don't know, you should speak to the city, the agencies, the department, the state. And it begins this whole cycle of finger pointing, not me, someone else. So when we come to these hearings, the public that is attending these hearings is looking for information. And that information begins with the impact, the cost, studies, determinations, so that they're more informed as well as the council members. But thank you. Thank you, Chair Brandon and Cornegie.
Thank you, Councilman. I want to go back to the urban flooding and the floodplain. Janie, the properties located within the 1% flood zone that have a federally backed mortgage or that have experienced a flood disaster must have flood insurance, right? FEMA developed this new flood insurance rating system called Risk Rating 2.0. All those new policies became subject to this new system on October 1st of this year. And the city's 10 poorest zip codes, 38% of premiums will increase. So what is the city doing, if anything, to help alleviate this economic burden, especially during a time like this?
So Chair Brandon, I'm actually not familiar with the data that you provided. I heard it in your opening testimony. What I can say is that FEMA has provided aggregate level data at the federal, state, and zip code level, but has declined New York City's request to provide more granular data at the individual property level to understand how individual properties will be impacted by the changes. So what I know is that in New York City, about 38% of residents will see premium decreases, and about 61% will see premium increases. Most of these increases will be relatively moderate, resulting in no more than about $20 a month. And we know that different factors have been considered, things like flood history, property location, property value, but FEMA has not publicly or privately shared how these different pieces are evaluated relative to each other. But in terms of your question about everything that the city is doing, in general, the city provides training and information about the National Flood Insurance Program and flood insurance in general for city agencies, for nonprofits, as well as annual briefings for local, state, and federal elected officials, and we do outreach events with residents. We recently offered a briefing for council members in September in coordination with FEMA to share updates on Risk Rating 2.0, and we'll be partnering with Flood Help and Why this fall on further outreach around these changes. As discussed in the New Normal report, we are also planning to expand Flood Help and Why for all New Yorkers. This program was previously funded and only offered to Sandy affected areas because it was funded with federal disaster recovery dollars. So we're expanding the program now. And, our office continues to work with city agencies such as HPD, DCP, and New York City Emergency Management to provide flood insurance information to communities through existing outreach and communication channels. We've participated in over 200 events to provide this information. And Flood Help and Why is just our main vehicle to make sure that New Yorkers are aware of their flood risk and have assistance to navigate the National Flood Insurance Program, which can be incredibly complicated. And as I mentioned in my testimony, just very recently, between July and September, we ran a visible $1.1 million campaign in collaboration with FEMA headquarters, raising awareness about flood insurance.
Can you tell me what neighborhoods the outreach was conducted in?
I can't tell you off the top of my head. I'm happy to get you more information about.
What was like the rubric used for where you did the outreach?
So as I mentioned, Flood Help and Why has been a program that's been that was funded previously with post-Sandy federal disaster recovery dollars. So the communities that were focused, that were the main focus of Flood Help and Why and the outreach were Sandy impacted communities, places like Southern Brooklyn, Southern Queens, where we saw a lot of Sandy damage. We just recently in the New Normal report expanded Flood Help and Why to also serve inland communities. So we're going to be expanding that outreach significantly. And I just also want to mention that on top of all this outreach that we're doing through Flood Help and Why and the services that we provide through Flood Help and Why, we are also very loudly advocating to Congress and have been for many years to substantial reform to the National Flood Insurance Program, particularly focused on affordability. We've been quite concerned about the impacts that Risk Rating 2.0 can have on the financial resiliency of New Yorkers, especially low and moderate income New Yorkers. So we have been, as I mentioned in my testimony, we testified to Congress. We've been writing op-eds and getting the word out about our concerns and engaging with FEMA about them, and we will continue to do that. And I just also want to clarify that the Flood Help and Why program is particularly targeted to low and moderate income New Yorkers. So that just wanted to make sure that was made clear.
Okay. The data that I referenced is from an article in the City from October 12th, 2021. Just for your info. I know your office has been working on the future flood risk maps. And based on the most recent timeline that we received at the council, the modeling and mapping of these maps was to be completed in May 2021, with the public-facing tools to be developed this past summer. So could you give us an update on where we're at with all that?
I'm happy to give you an update. The future flood risk maps are actually based on the mapping that FEMA is doing to reissue the FEMA flood insurance rate maps. They need to do that modeling first, and then we're essentially going to be layering sea level rise on top. I'm surprised by the data that you have. I'd be happy to work with your office on that, because that the FEMA flood insurance rate maps are not complete and are not going to be complete for several years. So we are going to work closely with FEMA to push for those maps to be complete, and then in parallel be working on the future flood risk maps.
So how do you think these maps would influence or inform development decisions along the waterfront?
I'm happy to speak to that. Thank you for the question. So essentially, our building code right now takes into account our latest understanding of flood risk, which is the 2015 FEMA flood insurance rate maps. But FEMA flood insurance rate maps are based on historic flood risk. And what we are doing is accounting for sea level rise through the future flood risk maps, so that we can understand the risk that's posed by sea level rise at a property specific level, so that we can essentially use those maps as a regulatory tool, and one day, with council's help, integrate them into building code. That will ensure that any new building or substantial rehabilitation takes future risk into account going forward.
Okay. Just so you know, the data that we have and the data that was mentioned in that article, the October 12th article in the city, was actually from a presentation that was given to us by the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. Presentation was given in May of 2020. So that data shouldn't be puzzling to you.
I'd be happy to check on that. I have not seen any data about the 10 poorest zip codes in the city. I'm not even sure. I need to check on that. So I'm happy to check on that and follow up with your office.
Okay. So Local Law 41, the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines, is recently enacted. And part of this law requires that each agency identify projects in their portfolio to be part of the pilot program that will help inform these guidelines. Can you give us an update on the pilot? And I think it was supposed to have commenced in the end of August.
Yes, I'm happy to. So first of all, thank you to Council for your leadership and partnership in passing Local Law 41. This is an incredibly impactful step we've taken to move towards a mandate of the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. And it's just an incredibly important step towards mainstreaming resiliency across city investment. So thank you for your partnership on that. We are going to be releasing, as I said in my testimony, the list of pilot projects that are in the pilot program very soon. I'm hoping later today. We're delighted to share that 23 city capital agencies are participating in the pilot, and will be designing and constructing dozens of new projects using the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines. There were 40 pilots that were selected through this process, and the process considered climate exposure, equity, and project scope. Over 40% of the projects are being advanced under this program will be constructed in environmental justice areas. I think this pilot is going to be able to inform the broader city mandate around the use of the design guidelines across the entire capital plan in 2026. So it's an incredibly informative and important step. And we look forward to staying connected with Council as we move through the pilot.
What are the city's views on constructing homes and businesses in areas that regularly flood now?
I mentioned in my testimony the coastal land use framework that DCP has developed. And I think this is an important tool to sort of frame this response, because we know that in the city we have a growing population. We know in this city we have a growing population. We also face an affordable housing crisis. And so we need to both continue to address our housing needs and the needs of our growing population, while we also address the risks that are posed by climate change. So the coastal land use framework, is science-based and acknowledges that in areas where we are able to, we need to increase density to create housing opportunities and maintain housing stability. And again, all this is informed by the best available climate science. We also, there will be neighborhoods where we need to maintain permitted density, and then there will be neighborhoods where we must limit density given the presence of high tide flooding now and the worsening of that flooding due to sea level rise. Where we are limiting density, we've developed a new zoning designation called Special Coastal Risk Districts. And this designation was only developed through extensive community engagement. That was really important as part of the arrival and approval of this designation. And I will also say that in those areas that are designated special coastal risk districts, residents can still make improvements to their homes that may make their homes safer in the face of continued flooding. And additionally, all new construction that's sited within the floodplain must meet the stringent resiliency requirements that are laid out in Appendix G of the New York City Building Code.
So is there, what are the city's views then on constructing homes and businesses in areas that will regularly flood a decade from now, 2 decades from now?
So the coastal land use framework that I described actually takes into account the climate projections through 2050. So we're not just taking into account the current conditions, but rather future conditions.
And what are we doing to educate and support those homeowners and businesses that are already in the areas of high flood risk?
It's a great question. So again, I'm going to refer back to Flood Help and Why, because it is an important tool that we use to deploy information about flood risk and flood insurance requirements. And now that it is a program that we can deploy citywide, we will use it that way and ensure that we're doing education about flood risk in communities across the city.
Okay. Several recent waterfront development projects plan to incorporate resiliency measures and affordable housing, including the River Ring in Williamsburg, the Fordham Landing project in University Heights, in Mott Haven, the Bronx Point project. These projects are in or adjacent to the floodplain. Can you just give us an overview of what resiliency measures are in place for these projects, and if there's an update on these projects?
So what I can say is that any new projects would in the floodplain would take into account the stringent requirements that are part of Appendix G of the New York City Building Code. And I'm happy to defer to my colleague, Assistant Commissioner Ackroyd, to describe those requirements.
Sure. Thank you, Director Bavishi and Chair Brennan, for the question. I don't have specifics on those particular developments, but I can speak to the requirements of the construction codes, specifically Appendix G. So if a development is located within the special flood hazard area, then the requirements of Appendix G would apply. If it was located adjacent to the special flood hazard area, the way the code is currently structured, then Appendix G would not apply. So buildings that are non-residential for flood zone purposes have 2 options for compliance. The first being elevating the lowest floor and providing nothing more than parking, storage, and building access below that lowest floor. And that is one strategy. The second strategy is dry flood proofing. If that building is non-residential for flood zone purposes, that would be, designing the structure to resist all of the flood loads and keep the water out of the spaces below the design flood elevation. It would also, those types of buildings are allowed to have uses other than parking, storage, and building access below that lowest floor because they are dry flood proofed. So there are a few strategies for construction in the special flood hazard area. We do have many buildings in the special flood hazard area that are, there is development going on in the special flood hazard area, and provided it's compliant with Appendix G, then it can move forward. For purely residential buildings, dry flood proofing is not permitted, and such buildings need to have that lowest floor elevated above the design flood elevation, and again, nothing other than parking, storage, and building access below the design flood elevation. They're also prohibited from having subgrade spaces. So that's just a quick and dirty overview of the types of strategies for new construction in the special flood hazard area.
And what factors are we using to determine whether to install gray versus green infrastructure, or a combination of the two?
I'm sorry, Chair Brannon, could you repeat the question?
Sure. So what factors are we using to determine whether to install gray versus green infrastructure?
At the building level?
Yeah, or any specific location. How are we determining which we're going with?
So let me speak at a high level, because this question comes into play even in sort of like coastal flood protection projects or stormwater management projects, or even how we're advancing our heat resiliency portfolio.
I guess I'm just trying to get to, how does the city determine where we're doing gray? But how do you determine that? I mean, there's got to be some sort of methodology for it.
So what I would say is that, it really depends on the particular site in which we are implementing resiliency measures. And we're always looking for ways to implement green measures and incorporating and blending green and gray measures wherever we can. So, for example, I'll just talk about a few coastal protection projects. And then I can talk about stormwater and heat resiliency as well. So for in terms of coastal protection projects, we've got the Rockaway Atlantic Shorefront project, which, because it's on a beach, we're able to use measures like putting more sand on the beach as a buffer for future storm surge. The sand dune that is already there is also an important element of the project, but the gray part comes in because we are reinforcing the dune with stone and steel to create additional reinforcements and additional layers of protection for that vulnerable community. With the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project, we are building a flood wall, but another big sort of feature of the project is creating pervious surfaces within the park to absorb stormwater. So it's just another kind of blending of different measures. With stormwater resiliency, we'll be advancing cloudburst management projects, but as we assess potential sites for cloudburst management, some sites may be open space that are green spaces that can absorb stormwater. Other sites may be where there's more, where there's less sort of pervious surfaces. We may have to look to streetscapes or recreational areas like basketball courts to absorb stormwater, to store stormwater, I should say, and then take pressure off the sewer system. Similarly, with heat, we are focused on planting street trees and increasing vegetation. It's one of the most useful strategies, most effective strategies in lowering neighborhood temperatures. But we are also recognizing that some areas of the city are denser than others, focused on increasing reflective surfaces, for example, through our Cool Roofs program, because where we don't have enough space to plant street trees, we need to also be using other measures like reflective surfaces to bring down temperatures.
Okay. Who do we have here from the Buildings Department?
We have Assistant Commissioner Ackroyd.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I wanted to ask in relation to what happened in Miami. Have we changed anything here? Are we doing anything differently? I know in Miami, I believe there's a requirement for an inspection 40 years after something's built. Is there any sort of similar requirement here in the city? And are we doing what they're doing? Are we doing anything differently after that happened?
Thank you for the question, Chair Brennan. So I think it would be prudent to first acknowledge that there's an ongoing forensic investigation at that site. And I think we're all feeling as though deferred maintenance played a role, but we're not certain on, the exact cause. And so therefore, I'm not sure that we're ready to enact any measures to necessarily address those specific concerns. But I would say that the department, I should say that the construction codes currently have a series of inspections that are required that would, alert an owner to possible structural issues. So for instance, we have our facade inspection and safety program, where buildings over 6 stories are required to periodically inspect exterior walls and appurtenances every 5 years and repair those deficiencies that are found. We, as part of local law 126, which is the update of our construction codes, we have incorporated a parking structure condition assessment that would require a condition assessment every 6 years and an annual parking structure observation. Now, I just want to highlight that this isn't in reaction to what happened in Miami. It's just what's prudent for New York City. And I think as more information comes available, the Department of Buildings and the City of New York, our sister agencies would be happy to work with council to figure out the appropriate modifications to the construction codes or any additional inspections that would be appropriate to address similar structures here in New York City.
Okay. This might be a question for the Miami Buildings Department. Is there an idea of when we think that forensic investigation is going to be completed? Are we following that?
We are certainly following that. And we're working with the International Code Council to stay on top of it. I know they are. I don't have a actual projected completion date, but we are following it and have acquaintances and colleagues that are truly a part of the investigation, and we feel like we'll have that information as soon as it's available.
I have some more questions, but I want to ask one last thing and then give it over to my co-chair today, and then I'll come back. For 2189, to study the feasibility of burying all the existing still above ground power lines. I guess just broadly, does the city support this bill? And what is your position on whether some or all of the remaining overhead power lines in the outer boroughs should be placed underground?
I'm going to defer to my colleague, Deputy Director DeRoche, to answer this question.
Thank you for the question, Chair. So we understand that Con Edison is moving forward with plans to underground areas of the power lines in areas of the city. And we're looking forward to working closely with them and also with council on what these future plans are. We believe that this exploration of how and where to underground power lines would really only be feasible and useful if it's led by Con Edison, of course, with our office in an advisory role. So, when we talk about the resiliency of the grid, it is one of our top priorities. We are moving towards a clean energy future, but that grid also needs to be resilient to climate change at the same time. And due to the city's advocacy at the state level, Con Edison and other local utilities have conducted climate change vulnerability studies and have climate change implementation plans. So, there are many ways to integrate resiliency into the grid. That includes storage capacity, as well as new transmission of renewables. Undergrounding is really one tool in the toolbox, and it can be used well in the right circumstances to reduce the frequency of outages.
Yeah, I mean, we're constantly told that burying the remaining vulnerable overhead lines in the outer boroughs is just cost prohibitive, but I struggle to understand how mass outages and their exponential impact is somehow cost effective. So, I mean, I guess if the city doesn't really have to pay for this, then are you guys fully, I mean, are you fully in support of this? Why wouldn't you be in support of burying all the overhead power lines?
So we are supportive of burying those lines in the right places under the right circumstances. And as I said,
What does that mean?
so again, we don't have the data to be able to evaluate this on a neighborhood by neighborhood level. And Con Edison is here to talk through that. They are currently working to underground certain neighborhoods in the city and can give you details on that. And I understand that in their next rate case, which the city will be a stakeholder in, they'll be asking for additional funding to expand that program. We look forward to looking at what those plans are. And if those plans make sense from a cost perspective, the city will support them. We just don't have the details, nor do we have the data to do that evaluation ourselves.
Okay. Just let the record reflect that Manhattan has 0 overhead power lines. Last thing, and then I want to give it over to my co-chair. What is the DOB doing, and what is the DOB contemplating any policy changes that would help protect residents of basement apartments from fatal flooding in the future, based on what we saw in August?
So,
and if a resident is living, if a resident right now is living in an illegally converted basement apartment, are there resources available to them that, you know, would still hold them harmless from, you know, sort of reporting themselves?
It's a very good question. Thank you, Chair Brennan. And to the first part, I know that the Department of Buildings is participating in a task force that is grappling with the legalization of basement apartments. This is certainly something that the city recognizes is an issue, that there are many affordable housing units in these basement apartments, but also that they are in need of legalization. So there is a task force that is working to attempt to streamline and also to develop strategies that are appropriate for New York City. I know that the basement pilot program is serving as a sort of a model for how to examine the construction codes and try to make modifications to allow for basement apartment legalization where it's appropriate. But again, I think we learned a lot or are learning a lot as a result of Ida, and this task force is hopefully going to provide us with additional information so that we can prioritize changes to the construction codes if they're appropriate, and any sort of enforcement action that's appropriate.
So if they reach out, if I'm living in an illegally converted basement apartment and I reach out to understand what resources are available to me, will I face repercussions?
I'm reluctant to answer that question because I don't have the answer. I don't have the answer for you. I don't believe that the department is vacating those basement apartments. But again, I would like to, coordinate with the appropriate units and provide you accurate information.
So what have we, I mean, it's 2 months later now. So what have we done? If folks are living in these apartments, we know they are. We know it's due to an affordability crisis in our city. If people are scared to death now that they're seeing what happened, especially in Queens, they reach out to the city for help. What are we doing? What are we doing?
So I think the Department of Buildings is providing, we immediately following Ida, there were many sessions for homeowners to come in to the Department of Buildings to understand what the process is for filing with the department for repairs, providing any support we can within our area of expertise and within our jurisdiction. I know the city is working on a more comprehensive communication plan to help get the word out in advance of a future event. And I know that is essential to the safety of these occupants. I know that that is a role that OEM plays and amongst other agencies. So, you know, I think that the focus is not on necessarily vacating these basement apartments. It's more on you know, helping people to get back to normal and you know, focusing on further study to figure out the appropriate strategies to effectively and appropriately address this. It's a complicated issue.
Yeah, understood. I mean, I think we, need to come to terms with the fact that people are living in illegally converted apartments, not because it's their first choice, but it's because it's all they can afford. And ultimately, if they can't live here, then they're going to be homeless. But if they reach out to the city, there needs to be some sort of immunity given to them if they're just looking to figure out how they can stay safe. And if they can't stay safe where they're living, then that's another story. But I just thought we were further along in what we were doing about that. I just worry that if it's a type of thing where people feel they have to reach out to find out what resources are available for them, they're going to be, ratting themselves out basically, and we don't want that.
Chair Brannon.
Yeah, I hope there's some sort of amnesty that's given to these folks.
This is really an interagency issue, and emergency management and HPD both play very, very important roles here. Unfortunately, they're not here today, so I think this is something that we can follow up with you on.
Yeah, it's pretty damn important. So, all right, thanks, guys. I'm gonna hand it over to my co-chair, Rob Cornegy.
Thank you, Chair Brannon. I do have to say that the chair has been incredibly thorough in his line of questioning, both on recovery and resiliency and on DOB and regulation issues. I do want to double down on a couple of things. One is Councilmember Jonai's line of questioning as it related to, the responsibility of the city to move forward and to align ourselves with the federal government for resources, especially around alternative energy and burying the power lines in the outer boroughs. I don't think it's incumbent upon Con Ed, with all due respect to Kyle Kimball, who I see is on the call, I don't think it's Con Ed's responsibility to navigate or negotiate that process. I feel like it's the city's responsibility to do that. And I think that it's just really important at this particular time. If I hear the words recovery and resiliency one more time, I'm just going to go crazy. And for us not to be coordinating with the federal government in any real way with these literally trillions of dollars that will pour in for infrastructure in the city, I'm kind of at a loss. And that's less of a question and more of just a statement of where we are and what's important as a city. Recovery and resiliency, recovery and resiliency. We hear it every single day, and yet we're sitting here on top of trillions of dollars of infrastructure spending that have been earmarked for infrastructure, and we have really no plan to access them to upgrade the city in a way that protects its residents and energy, and I find that incredibly concerning. If anybody would like to speak to that, I know Councilmember Jonai is as livid as I am, not being able to have any real concrete answers to what we're going to do moving forward with the money literally figuratively and literally on the table as we speak.
Chair Cornegy, I would like to speak to that. And I certainly don't want to leave you with, or any of the council members with the impression that we are leaving any money on the table. So Congress has just passed a huge infrastructure bill, as you noted, and the funding that's made available by this infrastructure bill presents a very unique opportunity to advance projects, adaptation and resiliency projects proactively. And I think it will be projects, programs, and planning across the city. Specifically, funding was made available for waterfront resiliency infrastructure, community vulnerability assessment and planning, transportation resiliency, residential heating and cooling assistance, household weatherization, as well as dedicated funding to FEMA's Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities grant program, and for the Army Corps of Engineers resiliency planning and projects. So I just want to assure you that the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, city agencies, federal legislative affairs, and OMB are all collaborating quite actively to understand eligibility requirements for this funding and identify resiliency projects and programs that will best serve the most vulnerable communities, adapt our infrastructure, and make the city more livable for New Yorkers. And in addition to the infrastructure bill, there are other sources of federal funding that will become available over the next year, which we are actively planning for as well, including FEMA's COVID Hazard Mitigation Grant Program funding, funding that's made available in the IDA supplemental appropriations. And then next year, the State Environmental Bond Act will go to voters, and that could unlock important resources as well. So I just want to be clear that we are, certainly eager to get those dollars to New York City. We are actively planning for that, and that will go towards energy projects as well as other resiliency projects across the board.
I thank you for that response, but I guess the simple question is, how can we ask for resources when we don't know the cost? We sound crazy. Like you're going to ask or lean on the federal government to some degree to provide those resources, and we can't even provide to the council what the estimated cost would be for that type of infrastructure development.
So the infrastructure needs of New York City are quite varied, and we do have cost estimates for a range of projects that we are going to be advocating for and competing for federal funding for. That is not limited to the undergrounding of power lines.
Unfortunately for me, December 31st marks my transition from the council, but I'm hoping that you will provide to this body and these two chairs, at least at some point in the very near future, what we feel like that spending would be on infrastructure projects. I know that it's probably not a public document that can be shared, but I feel like the council should at least know what we're fighting for. And if you could provide that to whoever my successor, whoever Councilmember Jonas' successor or Councilmember Brandon will still be here. Unfortunately for you guys, he's going to still be here, and he's going to probably want you to follow up with those numbers. So thank you for your testimony, though.
We'd be happy to follow up. And I just want to say that I think the first step is really understanding what the eligibility requirements for these programs are. There are big buckets of funding and big numbers out there, but there's still more information we need to understand what kinds of projects will be competitive. So we'll keep the council posted as we have that information, and then we follow up with additional information.
Thank you. As I said earlier, my co-chair was very thorough in his line of questioning, but there's another thing I'd like to double down on. And obviously, as the chair housing and buildings, I've been very intimately involved both in this legislative session and in the last legislative session on the basement pilot program. And I've literally been referring people back to the city when they're asking me, can they get help? And now I'm a little concerned that, my grandmother had a saying that we fatten frogs for snakes. I feel like I'm fattening a whole bunch of homeowners for snakes by sending them back to the city, and you didn't make me feel any more comfortable. I literally, during this process, during the pandemic, during the early stages of the pilot program, were referring families to bring their homes online. And now I'm not certain that that's, I haven't heard any feedback from people that I've referred, but I'm concerned that we don't have a process that either grants amnesty, where there is safety. Listen, safety is a priority. Safety has been a priority for me as the chair from day one. So safety is 100% my priority in even the basement pilot program. But in order to bring these units online throughout the city where there's affordability needs, I'm a little concerned at Commissioner Ackroyd's your answer, and this is not an indictment of you. It's just kind of an indictment of city agencies when we're responsible to provide a referral process for constituents, and now I'm not sure that referral process will yield for them what they'd like, which is ultimately to have the information necessary to make their unit safe and to actually find available programs to help them with recovery and resiliency in basements in general, but certainly basement apartments that are providing affordability across the city. You don't have to respond to that, but I'm just a little bit concerned at that response. So there's just a couple more questions I have. Like I said, my co-chair in the true spirit of Brooklyn, has been very, very thorough in his questioning. But there's local law 126 that I do have some questions about. And I'll start with local law 126 expands the applicability of flood and flood zone requirements of the 100-year flood hazard area to all critical facilities located in the 500-year flood zone. Have there been any plans to expand the applicability of these flood zone requirements to other facilities located in the 500-year flood zone? So that's a mouthful, I understand. But
I just want to clarify that the local law 126 is Councilmember Mattio's bill on Freeboard that was passed earlier this year. Is that right?
yes.
Okay. So let me start, and then I will.
I'm sorry, can I just clarify? Local law 126 was the update to the construction codes. So it updated the construction codes generally. I believe it was local law 43 of 21 that updated the Freeboard.
Okay.
Correct, Commissioner. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, well, what I can say here is that, you know, we are developing these future flood risk maps that will that will provide property specific information about future flood risks due to sea level rise. And our goal is to use them as a regulatory tool that can be integrated into building code and create more stringent requirements for new construction and substantial rehabilitation when it comes to keeping their property safe in the face of flood risk. But I will defer to my colleague, Assistant Commissioner Ackroyd, in case he has anything to add, because I believe he's more familiar with the local law and its requirements.
Sure.
Ackroyd, there's a couple of questions in local law 126. If I could ask those, and then you could answer them in sequence, as opposed to going back and forth, if you don't mind.
Fire away.
Local law 126 includes amendments that encourage the use of alternative energy production processes, including hydrogen fuel cells. Can you explain what other types of alternative energy production this law encourages? And I believe we had an earlier conversation on this hearing about alternatives, so it's kind of a timely question. And then lastly, how does local law 126 support the use of sustainable building materials? So just those three, Commissioner Ackroyd. And thank you for your patience on the questioning.
Sure. So we have been coordinating with the fire department, FDNY, on their revisions to the fire code, which I know you all are working on now. And as part of that coordination, we added the requirements on hydrogen fuel cells, and the idea really is that they're integral to ensuring sustainable energy production, but we want to ensure that it's being done in a safe manner. And I know that the fire code is also going to be addressing energy storage systems, so battery systems to be installed within buildings, and so that is something that we've been coordinating with FDNY on to ensure that the installations are safe, but also that there is guidance on how they're to be installed. So I think that those two items come to mind. The construction codes already address in the mechanical code many building system types. So I think that I'm drawing a blank to actually point to a specific system beyond that which is newly encouraged by local law 126, but I don't think that we are prohibiting innovation in any way. So I hope that answers your question, your first question. And then you had a question prior to this regarding the protection of critical infrastructure where the Appendix G is now going to mandate that critical infrastructure located in the 500-year flood zone be built to higher, more rigorous standards. And I think you were interested to know if we were contemplating expansion of the construction requirements for all buildings. And for this particular code revision cycle, I think that it was deemed appropriate to just think of fire, rescue, ambulance, police stations, designated emergency stations, power generating stations, those types of facilities for this expanded requirement, but would absolutely continue to investigate whether it's appropriate to expand the horizontal extent of the special flood hazard area. And I think that the incorporation of these climate smart maps is an opportunity to do that. So I just wanted to jump back to that and speak a bit on that. And then lastly, you asked about the support of sustainable building systems, I believe. And one thing that we're really happy to speak about with Local Law 126 is the allowance for cross-laminated timber. Cross-laminated timber is a sustainable material that we are now recognizing for construction in New York City. Previously, it was not recognized and was not allowed. And so this is a sustainable material that can be used for buildings up to 85 feet in height, up to 7 stories. And it provides an opportunity for an alternative. And so that is one example of a sustainable material, which is newly recognized by the updated construction codes.
So anybody watching these hearings sometimes believe that there's contention between the council and the agencies. I was very happy to work in conjunction with DOB on that particular bill and many others. So while these hearings look like from the outside, we don't work together, it's quite the opposite. Just so everybody who's watching, we worked together I proudly worked together with DOB and yourself on that bill and a ton of other bills over my time in the council. So I'm aware that if you're somebody new who's watching these hearings, you think they get your hearings, and they really aren't, because off camera we work together, I think, very well. And I'm hoping that the future will yield the same type of collaboration and cooperation going forward. The city only benefits from that. So the city doesn't benefit from gotcha hearings. It actually benefits from us sometimes way into the midnight hour working together on pieces of legislation that move the city forward and provide extra amounts of safety. So that bill is just one of the hundreds I've been able to work on with you. So I want to thank you for that. I'm pretty much done with my questioning. I'd like to turn it back. I see Chair Brannan is back, so I'd like to turn it back to Chair.
There we go. Thank you, Chair Cornegy. I want to see if any of my colleagues who are still logged on, they have any questions? No? Mission Control is telling me no. Okay. Okay, I want to talk to Kyle because I know he's got to leave. I won't take that personally, Kyle. I know you. So let's talk about Joe and I's bill 2189, and let's try to dig in a little bit on the administration. Before was talking about how they support it, but they need to know where we're doing it. What is the rubric that Con Ed would be using to figure out where to bury these power lines? And that's what I need to know. How are we deciding which ones are more vulnerable? Which ones are more vulnerable than others? Like, are some overhead power lines somehow more resilient than others? Certainly, you and I speak quite frequently about this. And in my district, power goes out reliably twice a year, even if there's no storms, right? The winter, we always have one, and the summer, we always have one. I understand that, at least you have told me that Con Ed often feels like it's sort of a catch-22 because it's easier to repair the overhead power lines than it is to repair the buried power lines. However, power goes out reliably in the outer boroughs, and no one blinks. Power went out a couple summers ago in Manhattan, and it was a worldwide story. But Manhattan has 0 overhead power lines, while we're out here in the Ozarks dealing with this, whether there's a storm or not. So, are we getting to a place where Con Ed is ready to admit that the repairs and the damage is equally cost prohibitive versus what it would take to bury these lines? That's my first question. And I think the second is, how are you determining where, if and when we do this, where do we start and why?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Shakira, do you want to take that, or do you want me to? I would just introduce Shakira Wilson. You need to unmute yourself, Shakira. Yeah. So why don't you introduce yourself, Shakira?
Yep, I did. I needed permission though, so thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Permission granted, Shakira.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so good morning all, thank you. So great questions. And I would say in regards to the criteria that we're utilizing, so we do have a few demonstration projects going on currently right now. One is in Middle Village in Queens, and we're also looking to finalize a project in Staten Island. So what we are doing is we're looking at past service interruption data, history over 10-year period in major storm events. And we're looking at particular segments of our overhead system. So through a ton of benchmarking with peer utilities and also reviewing storm restoration data, we're looking at our restoration curve as a whole and the number of days it takes. And what we found was some of the laterals, or I would call a spur, off of the main run or backbone of our overhead circuits would tend to have more significant damage or be later on in the restoration curve. So applying the criteria, looking at outage, just simple objective outage data, the number of outages, also the duration, applying that to specific areas of an overhead circuit is basically how we come up with our list. And that list we came up working closely with our engineering team. We'll go through the list. The top jobs we'll go to first, like the one in Middle Village right now that's about 70% complete. We'll go out, we'll do field walks. We'll look at the feasibility of taking the overhead lines and putting them underground. Clearly, we'll look at the tree density. There's some factors there too as well. And then we'll decide if it's working with stakeholders and our customers. If they agree, we would start that process. And that's what we did with the current projects that are happening right now.
Yeah, I would say it's also important to note that just some of the questions that came up, just in terms of the data, this is that so 83% of the Con Edison system in the 5 boroughs is already underground. So what we're talking about is the remaining, 15, 17%. That's first and foremost. And just to address a question that Councilmember Joe and I asked earlier, I'm not going to point fingers at the city and say, ask them. I'm going to give you a direct answer. In 2013, the study that was done after Sandy said that it would cost about $42.9 billion to underground. So that's the number. And those are in 2013 dollars. And to address something that you said, Councilmember Brannan, it's actually not free to the city. There's actually a significant cost to the city as well. And in 2013, that was estimated to be about 18 billion. So if you escalate those numbers to today, it's roughly a $70 billion project to underground the remaining 17% of the system. Now, having said that, we are in the process of making smart investments in terms of, and when we say smart, it's all the criteria that Shakira just talked about, a neighborhood's relationship to, the transmission system and the distribution system. And these are just like very solid engineering decisions about where it makes sense. And it's important to know that this is something that, as you know, Tim Cawley, our new CEO, has made a priority. And so I think you'll see We are making more efforts to underground different parts of the city more aggressively than we have in the past. Whether or not that's an admission of anything other than we see the reliability benefits of having something underground, but it's not something that we can do, overnight. We can't really wave a magic wand overnight because of the cost. And
I know
Go ahead.
you have, I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. I know you have testimony, but let me ask you one.
That's
I
right.
want to hear it, but let me just ask you one thing before you do it.
Yeah.
Let's say I gave you $70 billion. How long would that take? Ballpark.
70 billion.
I had the full 70 billion for you in my checking account. How long does it take to get that done?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, because I think one of the things that we wanted to talk about here was that
are we talking decades or are we talking 5 years?
I would say
No.
decades. Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow. Okay.
It's a significant, and Shakira can talk about this. So we had two projects. You talked about the project in Middle Village. What's also important is that we have a project in Staten Island that we're working on now. Is the second project we're doing in Staten Island where a neighborhood we were going to underground and they actually did not want it.
Mhm.
So a significant part of this is stakeholder buy-in. So you can have your 70 billion, but there's certain neighborhoods who just don't want it.
So, but stakeholder buy-in, you mean like I need to get the grouchy neighbor who doesn't want construction done to agree to this?
No, meaning, so if you underground a neighborhood, a circuit, or a spur, as Shakira is saying, you have to get, so it's not just, undergrounding is not just a function of us putting our lines underground. That is one big component of it. The other piece is that we have to take, so if you think about your house now, it's connected outside and your fuse box to your house is probably somewhere on your first or second floor. So what has to happen for undergrounding is, yes, we have to bury our distribution line. And then we have to dig a trench in your front yard or through your driveway to your basement. And then you, as the homeowner, have to move your fuse box and the connection to the system from the second floor to the basement. And that's at your cost. And it's at your disruption. There's Con Edison costs and there's customer costs.
But why would that, what does that matter if my power is coming above or underground? Why does that matter?
Because it connects into your house through the basement. So everywhere there are underground power lines, the connection from the service box to the fuse box is in the basement. So you'd have to do rewiring in your house.
This is the first I'm hearing of this.
So there's a significant customer component to undergrounding.
But why does it matter if the power is already coming in, whether it's above ground or underground? Why does that affect what's going on in my basement?
So again, it's the point of entry. So our responsibility is up to the weatherhead, up into a home or our customer's property. And then beyond that, it's customer responsibility. So if you have an overhead service, typically that'll come in, like Kyle said, to the top or the awning of a house, and it'll come down into your meter pan above. When we go underground, we will now, like Kyle said, you trench up and then you're going to come up below your meter pan, and that work has to be done by an electrician. That is not something that we would do. That's customer responsibility. So your point of entry is going to change, and that's what Kyle's referring to.
Well, I assume that if we were to walk down this road together, this would have to be something that the city would mandate. This can't just be up to every neighbor if they want to do this or not. This isn't like getting FiOS.
I think Kyle's trying to jump in. But yeah, that it would be conversations. That is one option. Just like if you're doing a sewer project or you're looking, that's something that the city or various areas, that would be a conversation. At the end of the day,
your question was your question why does everyone have to agree?
Well, if we have to get everyone to agree, we'll never do anything. So that's
right. Well, that's the problem with underground. So we had that problem in Staten Island with this just recent project. We found an area that we identified using the data, and we had to do significant outreach to the customers one by one, knocking on doors, phone calls, and everyone on a circuit has to agree because it doesn't make sense that some houses would be under and some would be above, because it's a system, right? And so if you have a neighborhood where theoretically 10 houses were underground and one was above ground and a tree fell at the one, the whole 5 houses go down. And so the system is only as good as its weakest component in an undergrounding situation.
Okay. Do you want to give your testimony?
I don't know. It's up to you, Shakira. I mean, I think we're also fine to just answer questions, but
Either or, it's fine with me.
yeah, I mean, we can submit. We'll submit our testimony and just focus on the Q&A.
I'll read that on the beach this weekend.
The one thing I would say that I think is very important is that yes, undergrounding does have resiliency benefits. And it's going to be super important in the context of clean energy, the transition to clean energy and electrification. So the other big component that we're thinking about here is, so there's one piece of undergrounding, which is just taking a feeder that's above ground and putting it below ground and all the issues around that. But then there's the other piece of electrification. So if we are now picking up the load that was currently being served by natural gas, by electricity, if your neighborhood has one feeder, because we're going to be picking up electrified houses over time or buildings, we probably will need to run 2 or 3 more feeders, right? Because that's additional electric load that's being picked up by the electric system. So the other piece that's happening with undergrounding is, and will continue to happen with undergrounding, is thinking about, we're going to have to make investments to bolster the system anyway. So do we need to put them underground while we're at it? But I do think it's important to note that, yes, there are resiliency benefits to undergrounding, but you are trading storms. So, we have a lot of the storms that you talked about earlier were above ground storms, where you have trees falling on power lines, and you have wind and that sort of situation. But with underground situations, you're trading a windstorm for a heat storm. So if you have a 5-day heat wave of 98, 110, whatever you have with increasing heat waves, that does strain the system. And the problem with underground systems, as I think you said at the top, is when the power does go out, the duration of the outages can be longer, because you do have to find where the short is, and then you have to dig it up and then replace it. And so, and you also have salt with winter storms as well. So there are some, it's not a panacea for an outage-free grid.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, so while undergrounding, it's a component of many programs and initiatives that we have to make the system more resilient and reliable, but we want to make sure that we do it in the right areas where it provides the most benefit for our customers. And we think with these projects that we're currently doing, we're going to get a better idea of the costs. We'll have a better sense of what it takes to schedule, what it takes as far as the communication, working with our peer utilities that are actually, they share poles with us. So they have to do this with us to make it, people look at this for the aesthetics reasons. We can go under, but there's a lot of infrastructure that is out there on poles, and we all have to be in this together. So we're going to get a lot more information from these projects. And most certainly use those lessons learned moving forward, because this is something we're committed to doing. And we're going to have this part of our rate filing, and more to come on this.
Okay, I just realized I broke protocol here, and I need to let you guys introduce yourselves. So, so I'll let the lawyer handle that. Jess, you want to take that?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, if Shakira Wilson and Kyle Kimball, if you could please introduce yourselves for the record, just state your names and the organization or the company that you're affiliated with. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'll start. My name is Shakira Wilson, and I'm a Vice President of Electric Operations for Con Edison.
Kyle Kimball, Vice President of Government, Regional, and Community Affairs for Con Edison.
Thank you both. Chair, please.
We were doing a podcast there for a minute. I forgot we were doing a hearing of the City Council of New York. Councilman Jonai, do you have questions about your bill?
I do. Thank you, Chair Brandon. I want to thank you, Kyle and Ms. Wilson, for the feedback and answering some of the questions. I'm just trying to get a better understanding of this. How did we do Manhattan? How is it that Manhattan has underground power lines? What was the cost to those properties? To get a better understanding of, are we making this much more complicated than it really has to be? We currently have, and I'll compare it to New York City water lines and sewer lines, where the homeowner is responsible for the line up to the city's main connection. In this regard, why do we have to relocate the electric pan, I believe you referred to it as, from a top floor down to the basement, when you can bring the line underground up to the foundation of the building and run it exterior right up to where the existing point of connection? So that's one question. The second question is, who's responsible for the power lines to the point of connection in a home? Is that Con Edison? And if so, why would this be any different then?
Okay, so I'll take that. So just to the second question. So we have a responsibility, what's ours versus what's theirs. We have education out there that we always try to communicate with our customers. So we own up to the point of the weatherhead, and we maintain that service to our customers. Anything else beyond that, the customer is responsible to maintain.
For those of us that don't understand weatherhead,
sorry, the top of, I'm sorry. So sorry. So the top of the connection that comes in. So if you have an overhead service, it comes into the top where you have like a mast, and then you'll see it comes down to a pipe into the top of the meter pan. So everything in that mast that comes down is the customer responsibility. We own up until that point into the home. So in regards to Manhattan, so I think even earlier, you had mentioned, late 1800s. I know that the blizzard was there. I think the city back then, stated for safety reasons, all of Manhattan would be underground at that point. And that's well before the electric system that was beginning stages of when the electric system was actually developed. So in Manhattan, that was the edict. That was the way the system was built. And as you move to the outer boroughs, I would say that just like the trains with the MTA, you see all the trains are underground in Manhattan. As you go to our outer boroughs, much more cost effective not to continue that to be underground. And they're all, for the most part, overhead, like the train system. And I would just say that's similar to what the electric system and how that was built over several years. So I don't have the costs of what that was to maintain Manhattan or to do that initially. But that's basically, in essence, the electric system and where that started.
So I can have a better understanding, the weatherhead. From the weatherhead into the home is the responsibility of the homeowner, the property owner.
Yeah, and we can actually share with you. We have educational pieces that we can share with you and give out, because we give that out often. It's also on our website.
So then the responsibility of Con Ed would be to the point of the weatherhead.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can enter the same place that the current homeowner has the power entry coming in. And at their own discretion, they can ultimately in the future bury it below ground. When there's developments and those homes come down to those properties are redeveloped, they can do it accordingly, updating from overhead to underground. Am I correct?
Yeah, so we provide the service, and right now, all existing overhead services, we are obligated under our tariff to provide adequate service and maintain that. If an entity or customers, because we have this now, where a customer now decides that they would like to go overhead to underground, that entire process is their responsibility. And we have that. We have a few customers that will say, I no longer want to be overhead, and I'd like to go underground. And that is a process where we'll have our engineers, we have our energy services department that works with those customers. There is a cost for the customer that we provide, and they will go out and do that work on their own. So just want to make sure I clarify that a little bit. I don't know if that helps you or not, but.
I think the question is, if you ran underground and just essentially ran underground. So I guess his point is, why does the customer equipment have to move? That's his question in an undergrounding.
Yeah, so again, it depends on the situation. For the most part, it is that point of entry where you have to come into the home. And different homes, there's different levels. Sometimes the overhead comes on the second floor. To Kyle's point, it's not in the basement. Again, you're going underground, so you want to make sure that the facilities, and again, we have to meet, there's codes. We have to meet all of that. So for the most part, the customer would need an electrician in order to do that.
Yeah.
I'm back to the weatherhead. If we made everything underground up to the weatherhead, what would be the problem then from the weatherhead where it's the homeowner, property owner responsibility to the point of entry? You can leave that exposed. Since they're responsible for it anyhow.
Well, the weatherhead is on the roof.
So yeah.
So you're going from, like, the customer would have to do something, because the weatherhead now is something, it's like it's like on the tip of your roof near your guttering.
And I think what would help is, sharing that and maybe having the conversation to go over, because it can be, just going a little complicated. So, and we have visuals that can help.
I agree. Well, we should take that up. Can you tell me what the cost to Con Edison on an annual basis is for tree pruning, and you do this in partnership with the City of New York, and maintenance, if you have that answer? And then secondly, the cost of repair lines over the last 10 years. So we'll talk about from Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy forward. What was the actual cost that Con Edison, whether it be shared with the city or not, in financial burden to make those repairs for the last 10 years?
Okay, so I'll answer the tree trimming. So on an annual basis, we spend approximately $14 million in our tree trimming program. And yes, we do work very closely with the Parks Department. I would say about $5 million of that does go to the city, maintaining the lines in the city areas, in all the boroughs. So in regards to our relationship with the Parks Department, that relationship has definitely evolved over the years. We work very closely. I have arborists that are on my team that work with the arborists in the Parks Department. And when the Parks Department identifies trees that are dead, diseased, dying, we have a risk factor that we apply. The Parks Department applies to that. And we'll come out. We'll help clear the lines. Sometimes we tap trees below our wires. And we work very closely with them on that. But yeah, it's about $14 million. And then we have a 3-year cycle that we trim. And there's approximately 2,200 miles of overhead lines that we trim on a 3-year basis throughout all the boroughs.
And the cost of over the last 10 years for overhead power line repairs?
Do you mean as a matter of storm repair or just as maintenance?
Maintenance and repair. What was the total cost of all overhead? We're talking about the 4 boroughs, for repair and maintenance of overhead power lines.
It's not. I don't know if you have it, Shakira. I don't know if
I don't have all that for the city for the past 10 years. I will say storms at Isaias, so that definitely was about $150 million. But I don't have all of that storm data.
You know what the cost of Hurricane Sandy was to Con Edison for repairs?
It was probably I don't have the figure in front of me, but it was significant.
Yeah. Significant in the hundreds of millions, billion?
Not billion.
Oh, not a billion. Definitely not a billion.
So just one storm was 100. I'm sorry?
But you have to recognize that some of those costs from Sandy were costs that were incurred to the underground system.
Yes.
Right. So if you have transformers that needed to be replaced, and Sandy was a system-wide event that affected both overhead and underground.
Now, let me ask the question differently. When it comes to maintenance and repairs, is it safe to assume that there is more exposure to overhead power lines with damage from storms and wind and throughout the year?
If you have
Compared to
overhead lines,
underground.
they are exposed to wind elements more than you would underground.
So that if we talk about the future and how we spend and invest and think of every penny that we invest should yield a return, where it's we make the investment and over time it pays for itself in just maintenance and repairs. Is this something that we should be focused on when it comes to power lines?
So I think to your point, looking at, the amount that we spend during these events is definitely going to be part of that cost analysis. Of course, it's something you look into. But undergrounding, and we're not suggesting that we, clearly it takes decades if we want to underground the entire system, but there are other elements that we have in play that can help. And some of that includes taking underground cable and putting it on our poles. And we've seen during events where typically customers on the overhead system are supplied by open wire. It's much smaller, it's thinner, but by then taking them off open wire and putting underground cable on the poles to supply customers, that helps that. And that, being exposed to wind and trees coming down, we have trees that'll come down, but they won't take the power out. They'll just lay on that cable. So that's another element that we do. And again, it's just figuring out where the right places are to do the undergrounding and what makes the most sense. But of course, that would be part of our analysis moving forward.
Yeah, and one thing I would say, just also to supplement that, is we are doing, like I said, we're moving forward. We're going to put more undergrounding in our upcoming rate case that will be forthcoming this coming winter. But I do think it's important that while we're talking about costs, to know that it's going to be incredibly important that when you see these projects and these capital projects in our rate case, that we have the city's support. And Suzanne DeRoche, who spoke earlier, gave a very astute answer that undergrounding is but one of a series of tools that we can use to make the system more resilient in the face of climate change. And so it's going to be important that we have the city's support with these undergrounding projects going forward. And that's not only including just the money piece, but you can ask Councilmember Holden, who I don't believe is on. The project we're working on in Queens is in his district, and he's been instrumental in getting the community to support the undergrounding project. And you can ask him; it has not been easy. So that's one area that could be the council could be very helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Kimball. Thank you, Ms. Wilson. I want to thank the chairs for giving me the luxury of asking these questions, and I think this is going to be very helpful as we inform New Yorkers. Two last questions, and I'm done. Because a very complicated response. I know this is very complicated. Does anyone know what the cost to homeowners and businesses has been during these overhead power outages due to storms? Can anyone even estimate that actual cost?
Well, one cost that we can estimate, I think there's a lot of intangible costs that can't be calculated. But one thing that can be calculated, there is usually, we have been very proactive about giving reimbursements for food spoilage. And that's usually in the tens of millions of dollars, depending on the storm, sometimes less, again, depending on the storm. But that's
typically to homeowners, not to businesses, correct?
No, that's to both. It's usually for food spoilage in a restaurant or a home. Yeah.
And then the other factor would be based on the weatherhead location, the expense to the homeowner that had to bring their own electrician in, and then the loss of revenue to a small business that could never be recaptured again for the obvious reasons. We don't have any estimates on that as well. Correct?
I'm not sure I understand the question now. I thought I did, but I didn't.
So when there's a power outages, obviously businesses are impacted.
Yeah.
That means their businesses shut down.
Yeah.
There's no income. And you covered the food spoilage depending on the storm. But what we're not calculating in this is the amount of lost revenue to that small business and ultimately the taxable income that would come to the city. So when we look at an impact of a storm, it's just not the damages that had to be repaired, the reimbursement for food spoilage, but also an important factor is the income or the revenue that was lost and what that actually means in taxable dollars, whether
That's
it's
true.
sales tax collections, income tax, payroll tax. There's a real impact.
That's true. Yeah, I agree with that.
And where I'm headed with all of this, and thank you, chairs, is that we know that we should be looking at this as the total impact to New York City, homeowners and businesses, including the initial infrastructure investment, considering the impact, which is more than just an inconvenience to homeowners and business, but actually could have a light impact when it comes to equipment and a business component to it where lost revenue to the city of New York. There's a big picture. And this may be that time that we lobby Washington while they negotiate a $2 trillion package that will cover infrastructure as well. So I'm looking forward to getting as much information from both you, Mr. Kimball, and with Ms. Wilson, as well as the administration, on the effects and impacts of storms when it comes to power outages, specifically in and around the overhead power lines, and what that ultimately translates to in a form of lost revenue. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. I guess I'd like to just understand, I mean, and I don't know if you're going to like this, but I mean, I know, I mean, what we're hearing, what we continue to hear is that burying the remaining overhead power lines in the outer boroughs it is cost prohibitive. But I don't see how Con Ed or the city or anyone can contend that the mass outages and their exponential impact is cost effective. So how do we bridge that gap? And is that what you're trying to do?
So we're not really saying anymore that it's cost prohibitive. So that's just one thing to take off the table.
Right, but you're giving us the price and
no, because I just wanted to be responsive with facts. That's what the 2013 report said. And I know that was a contention at the beginning, but we're not throwing that, and we're not even arguing against undergrounding. Like I think we've talked about this in the past, and like I said, with our new CEO Tim Cawley, this is an important thing to him, and you're going to see undergrounding projects in our rate cases this winter. So we're not really saying that anymore. It's just that now we're transitioning to, we have to do it in an orderly way, in a cost effective way, and in a way that has the full backing of the city. So that's what we're really saying now is it's not really saying it's cost prohibitive, but it just needs to be done strategically, smartly, orderly, and in partnership with the city, because it is complicated. And it's not just the customer piece, it's the permits and processes, and construction in the city is not getting easier. It's only getting harder. And, I've been on your side of the screen on these hearings in terms of being a part of the city. And I know how much faster and quicker things go if the mayor's office of capital projects is behind something. They have an incredibly excellent staff who really knows how to execute projects. And so this is not something we can do on our own. We're going to have to do this in partnership with the city, DOT, DEP, and all these processes, and align the ministerial processes to get these projects in place, as well as the support. Councilmember Brannan, if we did a project in your neighborhood, we're going to have to be together at the community board hearing, talking to people who don't want to do this as to why it's a good idea.
Okay. Chair Cornegy, do you have anything?
No, like I said earlier, Chair Brannan, you were very thorough in your line of questioning. I do want to just thank everyone for their testimonies. I think it was informative. And on this recovery and resiliency, we got a lot of work to do.
Okay, Mission Control, I don't think we have any other members who have questions, right?
That is correct, Chair.
Okay.
We'll now turn it to public testimony. Is that okay?
Yep.
Great.
Thank you, Con Ed.
Thank you all.
Keep my lights on.
Thank you, Con Ed, for testifying. We will now turn to additional public testimony. I would like to remind everyone that we will be calling on individuals one by one to testify. Each panelist will be given 3 minutes to speak. Please begin once the sergeant has started the timer and given you the cue to begin. Council members who have questions for a particular panelist should use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call on you after the panelist has completed their testimony. For panelists, once your name is called, a member of our staff will unmute you, and the Sergeant at Arms will give you the go-ahead to begin upon setting the timer. Please wait for the sergeant to announce that you may begin before starting your testimony. I would now like to welcome Michael Dulong of Riverkeeper to present testimony. Michael Dulong, you may begin when the sergeant calls time.
Starting time.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Brannan and Chairman Cornegie, for the opportunity to testify today. I'm Mike Dulong. I'm a senior attorney with Hudson Riverkeeper. And I want to pick up on your line of questioning, Chairman Brannan, about what the city is doing to protect these new shoreline developments or all of the shoreline housing that's in place for the future and not just today. And what it sounds like and what I understand is that there are pretty good zoning requirements for building in the floodplain that will allow a building to survive inundation. But that doesn't mean that there is community resiliency. If a building is getting flooded once a year, once a month, that's just not a good place to live. And there's going to be demand for the city to step in and build resiliency measures or to buy those properties out. And what happens when you have even one flood event, you have disruption to electricity, utilities, even building access, disruption to roads. All of those things can affect quality of life and make things difficult. So as what we're seeing, what I see from the boat, when we take the Riverkeeper boat out and go into the harbor and up into the tributaries, where we used to see a lot of industrial properties, 2, 3, 4-story buildings, and a lot of activity going on. Now we are seeing major towers. You know this, you see the development too. It is like being on the water now is like walking down a New York City street where you're looking up in awe of all these monstrous buildings. And so that means that over the past 20 years or so, and looking out into the future, this is still happening. There is an enormous amount of shoreline development that is bringing thousands of New Yorkers right to that floodplain, but right in the most dangerous area, the most likely area to flood. A lot of those buildings have no protection. Some of them, like the River Ring project, are taking fairly drastic measures to build out, sort of reclaim areas of the waterway, to build out breakwaters to protect the building and only that local building. So there is no plan yet for all of this, no sort of unified citywide plan. 1620 is an incredible bill. The more I think about it, the more I appreciate what I think the fruits of that bill will be. It is a very broad study of climate adaptation for the city. It does not focus necessarily on the risk to housing stock, on the modeled building out of the shoreline of what's going to happen to all of these properties that are built. And so I encourage you to work with the relevant agencies to make sure that that is a highlighted part of the study, and that comes through so that we can see the risk. Let's see what mapping that over the city's flood maps, the development that's happened very recently and is ongoing, would go a long way to show you exactly what the problem is and how many New Yorkers are being put in the floodplain. And last, I'll just invite you out. I will just invite you out onto the boat. We're about to put it away for the year, but come see what this looks like and come see what's going on in your district on the waterfront. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. If we haven't inadvertently missed anyone who has registered to testify today and is yet to have been called, please use the Zoom raise hand function and you will be called in the order that your hand has been raised. Seeing none, I will now turn it over to Chair Brannan and Chair Cornegie to offer closing remarks. Chair Brannan.
Thank you. I'll hand it over to Chair Cornegie if he wants to go first.
Again, I want to thank you for co-chairing this very important hearing. I don't think we talk enough about safety and security on resiliency on our waterways and about energy conservation as we move forward. So I'm just thankful to all of the panelists who testified. And I look forward to continuing a long legacy of working in conjunction with the agencies to get us to a better place as a city. And we're a leader in globally in a lot of things. We have to take the lead on coastal resiliency and resiliency in our waterfronts. Thank you, Chair Brennan, for your hard work in this area. It was a pleasure to work with you today.
Thank you, Chair Cornegy. Yeah, you know, coastal flooding and severe storms are becoming more intense, occurring more frequently. New York City has endured and recovered from just about everything. And each time I think we come back stronger, that's guaranteed, but we also have to come back smarter. And I think we must move forward more informed about the risks that we face and better able to prepare and protect for our future. Ultimately, that's what resiliency means, right? It means getting up and brushing the dirt off and fighting another day. So I appreciate everyone who worked behind the scenes on this hearing. I think there's some follow-up we need to do around some of the basement apartment issues and what's being done there, as well as some issues with the flood insurance rating system and what's being done there. But other than that, I will gavel out and close this hearing today.